Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're super excited about our very first lecture of the semester. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Maxi Spina of Spinagu. Spinagu is a collaboration between Maxi and his partner Jia Gu, and was co-founded by the two in 2016. As probably all of you already know, Maxi and Jia are leading a visiting critic studio here this semester, and they had their midterm today. But what you may not know is that their VC positions are part of the visiting Sargent professorship, which is a special professorship that was created in honor of Dean D. Kenneth Sargent, who led the School of Architecture from 1957 to 1968. While he was dean, Sargent began the tradition that we now all know well of inviting distinguished practitioners to the school. Since the 1990s, the Sargent Fund has ensured that the Visiting Critic program will continue to grow and benefit future generations of students, such as yourselves, and it supports 2 visiting professors each year. Recent previous Sargent professors include Margaret Griffin of Griffin Enright Architects, Paul Preisner of Paul Preisner Architects, and Vivian Lee and James McGillivray of Lamas, and we're thrilled to have Maxi and Jia join this legacy. So Maxi and Jia's practice, Spinagu, is a creative studio based in Los Angeles that is dedicated to architecture and design. The two have been distinguished in recent interviews as one being the design director and the other being the creative director, which I find kind of amusing. As you know, their work is certainly indistinguishably intermixing notions of design and creativity, but also notions of technology, form, history, and materiality in ways that both cross-pollinate and dissolve the distinction between all of these categories. Truly, their practice is a result of their co-directorship of all of these areas and their equally potent interest in how these categories reveal and remake architecture as a cultural practice. That being said, the categorization certainly emerges from a desire to mark their individual and independent contributions to the practice, which do in fact come from rather different background experiences. So Maxi grew up in Rosario, Argentina, and after quite a technical B-Arc training at the National University of Rosario, received his M-Arc from Princeton and went on to work with architects such as Neil Denari and Studio Daniel Libeskind. Jia, meanwhile, grew up in Los Angeles and comes to architecture from an art background. She received her BA in Visual Arts from UCSD before attending UCLA for her M-Arc degree and now ongoing doctorate in Architectural Critical Studies. Before co-founding Spinagu, Jia also worked for Raumlabor Berlin, Something Fantastic, and Kyung Park. These different complementary experiences seem to be important fodder for the work of Spinagu. We could perhaps trace the technical prowess and beautiful material details of a project like Thick, their installation in the SCI-Arc Gallery from 2017, to Maxi's more technical training and professional experiences after. On the other hand, we could perhaps trace the critical disciplinary location of a project like Lega Entrega, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, sorry anyone who speaks German, to Jia's exhibition experience and ongoing doctorate work in critical studies at UCLA. But given their other work and academic experiences on both sides, I could probably argue precisely the opposite just as easily. Though there are certainly productive overlaps and reinforcements, perhaps the most critical role in expanding the territory of their work lies in the emergent frictions. As a result, their work extends from what we might think of as the more typical content for architecture studios like buildings and installations to objects and happenings slightly less traditional, chess sets, exhibitions, public programs, etc. Like many of our visiting critics, Maxi and Jia also teach and do a number of other things that prop up their practice and allow their interests in research to be tested in a variety of ways. Maxi is currently design faculty at SCI-Arc, and Jia is the curator and director of Materials and Applications, which is a Los Angeles-based nonprofit cultural organization dedicated to presenting new ideas in architecture and art through built experiments and critical programs. This multifaceted approach to their practice of architecture is not only productive and exciting, but also has the potential to carve out new spaces and new audiences for architecture and design in the city. And award and grant juries agree with this. Maxi is the recipient of numerous accolades, including a fellowship at the McDowell Colony, a nomination for the Mies Crown Hall Award for Emerging Architecture, and awards by the Chicago Athenaeum, AIALA, Architect Magazine, and ACSA. Maxi's research and design explorations have received grants by the Graham Foundation and the Frankel Foundation. Jia's projects have similarly been recognized and supported by numerous organizations, including UCLA, the Graham Foundation, LA Department of Cultural Affairs, LA County Arts Commission, and Pasadena Arts Alliance. We're super lucky to have Maxi and Jia here at Syracuse this semester as visiting critics, and I really look forward to hearing more about their work in tonight's lecture. So please join me in welcoming Maxi Spina.
And I can put this on my, okay, that's good. Thank you so much, Molly, for the great introduction. I also wanted to thank more generally Dean Michael Speaks for inviting us to teach, hi Michael, to teach here this semester as visiting critic. It's been fantastic, very productive conversation we have at midterm today. Also wanted to thank faculty and staff for being so welcoming and nice to us since we arrived here in this semester. It's been a pleasure to be here at Syracuse. I should say or mention that the talent, the intelligence, and the wit of my partner Jia Gu, who is not here in the stage today. She could probably do a much better job of presenting the work than me, but she's a huge part of what we do at Spinagu. You will see her here in the following weeks in our studio downstairs, which we invite everybody to pop up. Today's lecture, it's a survey of our recent work. It's funny to say recent work for an office that's been in existence for about 5 years. It's more or less our body of work. It's very recent. The work you see today is that it shows a relationship between views and viewing, between what we call scenes and screens, in order to turn our attention to how such techniques of viewing can similarly affect modes of thinking and making. I'm going to go through it, just a pinpoint through some images of our projects as I introduce our practice and position our practice, and then I'm going to go more specifically through each project. But wanted to first to kind of position the practice. If there is a point in which to kind of conceptually situate it, will be somewhere along the arc of an arc that theater historian Arnold Aronson used to kind of describe the history of scenography, and we like to refer to this idea as a kind of pendulum swinging between a battle with space and on the other hand a battle with the image. For us, we find that our architecture occupies a kind of self-similar category between an impetus for image making and an impulse for space making. We understand our practice to be working under a contemporary condition in which the architectural object, its physical, its spatial, and its kind of constructive reality is both sanctioned in a digital milieu that suggests a lack of fixity to a single representational environment, but it's also superseded by its endless circulation in a network culture via the infinite reproducibility of digital images. This is what we usually call the dual pressures of the digital. On one hand, digital tooling, and on the other, digital imaging. The earlier allowing for the endless finessing of form, and the latter for the endless circulation of images, which we believe is a condition that have pushed other forms of technological and visual explorations to the periphery. So as a studio, we're interested in interrogating architectural modes of productions in order to understand how these architectural tools and procedures produce an effect perception itself. The survey of work that you will see today spans multiple scales and covers a kind of broad range of interests, as Molly outlined earlier, that go from scholarly investigations into the history of architectural representation and exhibitions, the interrogation of digital procedures, and the representational space of software. And here is where we think it is important to try to relay back a little bit this representational space of software to some ideas that have to do with reproduction, especially looking at Walter Benjamin's seminal text, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and to foreground one of his arguments, which is that the modes of production themselves come to define the status of any given work, whether it is photography, text, or architecture. As architects, we work under regimes of reproducibility, whether in the form of the printed image or the 3D printer, or even in the kind of industrialized ready-mades. Things, for instance, of dimensional lumber as just one example of that. So the question that how do technologies of reproduction affect architecture's modes of production, technical, cultural, it's super relevant to us. The ubiquity of technologies such as photography, imaging, the kind of mass production of images, challenges our notions of authenticity, and it's something that we constantly want to kind of rethink. Even Robin Evans, in his seminal essay in Translations from Drawings to Buildings, argues that there is no original, no authenticity, and no hand of the architect, mostly famous in the line that architects don't build, they draw. Evan argues that architects produce representation not as original acts, but as instructions for building. Representation is therefore a tool to enact a process of building rather than to represent or merely document an object. So Evan argues that architects use drawings as instruments to move from ideation to construction, and that drawings are not merely graphic or technical documentations that architects use, but in fact they are conceptual. Ultimately, we'd like to think that both Benjamin and Evans are thinking about how most of productions, such as photography or architectural drawing, are deeply entangled with modes of perception, such as authenticity or ideation, and ask how representations are in fact tied to the tools and techniques that construct them. So for us, it's worth asking how the digital environment of design softwares are conditioning us as perceivers and as users of our own work and of the material world around us. Are we in fact still drawing as we understand it within the traditional definition of drawing as an act of construction of geometries tied to the kind of procedural habits of putting pens to paper, guided by May lines, rulers, and drawing instruments, or are we really imaging a model? Ultimately, these questions of representation is not centered on a fetishization of computation or digital culture and screens, but it's asking, in the age of ubiquitous software, how should we understand and think about the tools and techniques that are imposed on us by our digital environments? Our tools are not merely producing representations for us, but are representing the world back to us. So one of the things that we consciously try to do in our practice is to work on projects that begin to try to avoid a clear definition of what is form and what is image, and try to think of those projects as revealing different modes by which perception and production comes into being. So the body of work today will show it's haunted by this series of insistent questions. How does one produce an architectural form that oscillates between a drawing and a building? How can we work through between both images and objects, not as separate sites, but as a kind of a synthetic act? How literally can we understand the process of digital tooling? How many ways can you possibly instantiate an image? And by image, we'll go later at the kind of broad definition that we understand it. Our work, I will argue then, it's about those sites of representation and their relationship to sites of production, materially or sites of production in the labor of the architect. It is also a product about architecture, many mediums, and the collapse of medium specificities in architecture. And as such, I think the work derives from thinking around tools and thinking about technology and techniques that informs and are informed by the act of design. So we're going to start from small to large. We're going to look at the kind of first product that kind of was the set-off for our practice. There are these two chess sets. There are going to be three chess sets that we're going to show them in different order, but you will get the point later why it's shown that way. These two chess sets that we'll begin with deal with the passage between orthographical systems of representation and description, and also material technology, and modes of ordering based on rotation. The first chess set, was for a commission for Gallery Jia and Jai in Los Angeles. The lack of medium specificity in the product is established in the circulation between orthography and turning. In the passage from discrete two-dimensional forms of representation that assume clear postures and forms of legibility of the object in the forms of front, backs, tops, and bottoms of the classic chess pieces. So from that passage to a kind of continuous, infinite, axial rotation of objects of revolution, like in the lathe. Wood turning in the lathe was by 1849 when Stanton created the chess set we all know today and we usually play with. It was the technology of mass production of most chess sets. In fact, that's what made it so successful, that it could be reproduced and it could be, mass produced. So the first reference in this is this kind of archetypal imagery present in the Stanton chess pieces, which is this kind of clean neoclassical lines reminiscent of a column-like tripartite division of Greece and ancient Rome. We found that the notion of profile and that of a figure to be one and the same in the Stanton set. So what it means is, if you think of this profile rotating infinitely around a lathe, it produces a figure that is very stable. So profile and figure produce a kind of same type of legibility. So we found that the portion of a profile and that of a figure to create that very stable definition. So we attempted to kind of decouple that condition at the beginning. We thought about how could that condition be pushed to differentiate profile from figure. That decoupling essentially was done by a fraction in full turns, the 360 degrees turns of the lathe, into partial turns, 90 degree, which we thought were more associated to the way architects work in orthogonal planes of projection. Those 90-degree planes will then hinge around three axes of Cartesian space, the X, Y, and Z. For us, that resulted in a kind of complicated composition of partial revolutions. Those portions of the whole are illustrated now as fractions of a turn that begin to change plane around the profile. So those delineated profiles that we began with, the vertical profiles that we know from the Stanton set, begin to acquire here a more thematic quality, and they manifest in one of two ways. First, as the kind of lines and curves indicating the cross-section of the chess piece, let's just call that the original, and also as the typical imaginary curves of geometrical unfolding, which is the architect labor in translating and hinging, and if you want to use an old term, rabatting that piece of geometry around in space. And one gets to see those two conditions simultaneously in the project. In a typical lathe turning operation, one can clearly differentiate between the object's elevation and plans and cross sections. In turn, this chess set, we wanted to confound those two conditions and upset any clear legibility existing between the kind of sidedness of the product between the fronts, back, tops, and bottoms. We think that obfuscates the kind of fixed axiality and fixed ground composition of the lathe. So I like to use this product because it's not just very important to us as our first collaboration, but also because it takes on a kind of clear set of problems, the problem of legibility, the problem of authenticity in a world that is ruled by these forms of reproduction, the lathe being one of them, the origin or originality, and from reproduction to copying, all of which you think converts into a particular notion of authorship. But what is also interesting about this process is how a mode of material production and tooling affects a mode of viewing. Define a notion of a particular viewing subject and assume ground planes, and essentially predisposing the viewership towards a contingent condition of free axial rotation of an object in space. So we're going to see the third chess set, and then we will come back to the second. This juncture between rotation-based tooling and orthographic representation is perhaps best synthesized in this one, we call last turn, as a way to just say we're not doing chess sets anymore. We're architects and we want to do buildings, but this essentially help us kind of think about ideas before having too many constraints that could push those ideas aside. And here begins with the premise of the product being prefabricated along the logics and possibilities of robotic arms. This was a constraint given to us. This product is part of a publication that SCI-Arc is putting together along 4 faculty members. So this was a task given to us essentially to remake a project along these constraints of being prefabricated by a robotic arm. So the project investigates some of the inevitable problems that arise when process of technological reproduction based on rotation encounter the conventions of architectural representation. What I'm trying to say is that when the logics of orthographic reproduction begin to collude with those of radial disposition. We wanted to investigate what kind of toolpath, what kind of choreographed circular movement of the robotic arms as a super well adjusted synchronized piece of rotating machinery will allow us to explore a reproduction of the original profile and still somehow result in an object that lingers in the threshold between orthographic projection and radial composition. So just something to explain here very quickly. So when we're talking about reproduction of a profile in space, the first project dealt with rotation of that profile in space. While the geometry is still the same, its position, its orientation is not, right? Even though you could argue it moves around, its condition of being oriented in the world, we thought that it wasn't a true reproduction. So we wanted to, instead of pushing this third project one step further in formal terms, we wanted to essentially push it back and try to investigate even a simpler way of investigating that form of reproduction. So we wanted essentially a still profile moving around in space, but not rotating, but somehow creating circular paths, which we thought at some moment was a bit of an impossibility, but that's what kind of essentially motivated the project. So the kind of toolpath that you see here enables what could be explained along an idea of hyperturning or a fully synchronized movement that involves rotation and orbiting. It's essentially like a planet which both rotates as well as orbits around a kind of celestial object. Through that kind of toolpath, we could achieve an exact reproduction of the profile at every point in the path. By exact, I mean it's what I explained earlier. Its spatial orientation remains fixed at every point through its position in the orbiting. So we became interested in this type of synchronized translation rotation process because for us it synthesized two types of formal procedures which we think to be somehow diametrically opposed to one another. And these are extrusions and revolution. We tend to think of these two formal devices as perhaps on the extremes on the kind of architect and formalism. And what results here is both a rounded object, which paradoxically has sides. Its sides are different even though it's rounded in plan everywhere where you cut it. So for these two projects, we focus on the kind of transformation of the architectural object as not only a kind of material system that is mediated through its representation, but it's itself a mediation, producing a constant circulation of readings between what we call technical, real objects and the kind of cultural practices surrounding the making of these objects. In this case, rotary machinery, the lathe, and technologies of rotation that were meant for reproduction. The next three projects all, and this kind of grouping that I've done for the lecture on just to kind of put the projects as a kind of families. These three projects all deal with the notion of objects that oscillate between simultaneously being a drawing, an object, or a building. And they reveal different modes by which perception and material production become somehow weirdly synthesized. Specifically, we're talking here about problems of digital representation, such as rendering, related to the description of stereotomy, which is it's one of those impossibilities, as I was mentioning earlier, with this idea of weird rotation and translation in space. Those kinds of impossibilities somehow attract our attention. So it's a problem that interests us because from a representation point of view, it escapes texture mapping and goes into territories of the real that the computer hasn't been able to fully conquer yet. So that was the kind of premise for our second chess set, which we call All the Turns, which, longer story, but it was born out of, these are the forms we discarded from the first chess set because they wouldn't fit on the square grid of the chess set. So we couldn't make a playable set out of them, so we kept them for another project. And that's why we call them kind of all the turns or kind of B-sides. So we look in this project at the problem of grain direction in representation as a notion that conveys both the depth and the posture of an object. So this second incarnation of the chess set continues those leads that we investigated before. The profiles turn around 90-degree increments and then changing planes or hinging around in space. But the studies and the tensions arise when the material grain as a form of description is decoupled from the form of the object. The problem of the grain interests us quite a bit, in particular when one attempts to relate it to problems of representation like delineating or shading or even rendering. In this case, those questions are explored through the juxtaposition of texture materiality. So the sidedness of wood, its combination of face, edge, and edge grains is exposed via the subtracted manufacturing, in this case of a 3-axis flip CNC mill. So seam wood layer wood begins to recreate offsets of either the profiles that we began with or the sweeping curves of geometrical unfolding, which is the operation of rotating those things in space. And depending on how the composition of the wood lamination is registered against the circular toolpath, these curves take the form of either cross sections or topographical curves. So that sidedness of wood that I explained earlier, how wood is read through its strength and how it's picked from a log to a dimensional lumber, here begins to convene to expose sub-regions within the formal languages of the pieces. That is to say that it begins to give away the overall plane of revolution we saw in the previous two chess sets, as the kind of grain direction is not continuous. These regions clearly do not coalesce into a coherent description. They don't cooperate with the form. The myriad of grain orientations and textures and seams as a form of description begin to kind of defy the continuity of the form. It's a bit of a kind of weird realism that flourish at the juncture between where stereotomy meets material texture. It's something the computer really can't replicate, and therefore that impossibility caught our attention for, we weren't sure what to do with it, but we thought that there was an interesting problem there for the description of an architectural object. But more importantly, it motivated another project that came right after that. So the question that we started for this was a SCI-Arc installation in 2017. The first questions that we had right after those chess sets were, how do we deal with this issue of material thickness, with this issue of stereotomy? How do we work in the computer to describe these physical issues digitally when working with material imaging? How do these properties instantiate themselves in these different environments that exist in? These were questions that foster the study of thick, this exhibition, and we thought about essentially how material thickness is an elusive side of design. The one thing that the project sought as a goal was a kind of evidence in the kind of strong interaction between the representational and the material. It looks at this kind of peripheral condition of thickness in architectural design and its role within process of digital production and tooling. Within the project, thickness doesn't refer to an actual solidity of the material, as in the kind of standardization of sheet material, right? Like it doesn't refer to the thickness that you will purchase that sheet material. It doesn't refer to the kind of nominal thickness of what material comes. It refers to another condition, which is a kind of conceptual and material problem that for us sits literally at the edge of architectural thinking. The condition of thickness, I'll argue the necessity of thickness for an architectural object, it really doesn't carry any central role in the area of architectural thinking, but it still manages to circulate through different areas of architectural thinking. So it's not specific to a particular area, but it always appears and reappears in different moments. Its condition is linked, but it's not central to the history of stereotomy and stone construction, and in the emergence of new types of architectural drawing that Robin Evans discussed in his seminal essay, The Developed Surface, and even in the kind of classical problem of the Doric order. The problem of thickness exists in a number of different ways in architectural history. And it's the consequence of architecture's lack of medium specificity and it's in its constant migration between the drawing, the picture plane, the screen, the toolpath, the material, and the assembly. In our contemporary milieu of digital software and environments, thickness has become a mere afterthought. It's in model softwares such as Rhino or Maya, the digital model is infinitely thin. Its default property, it's a single line or an algorithmic curve, and its thickness must be added. We always add it. It's not something we think about it from the beginning, if you want. So thickness in digital modeling is only information. It appears as usually as an offset, as an extrusion or an enclosed surface, we believe that that's where we begin to confront the limits of digital representation and its corresponding kind of property in material reality. I think as today's softwares embed increasingly fluid commands to carry information between platforms, the capacity of thickness to serve as a critical problem in digital production has been obfuscated by output commands and mechanic fabrication. It only reappears in mechanic production, either in the surfaces of 3D printing or in the excavation of CNC milling. The product in this exhibition that started through drawing and moved through several layers of the drawing through the pieces in space, attempt to kind of re-engineer that relationship between material fabrication and digital tooling, and for us, you know, we sought to turn attention to the means by which those materials conditions can similarly affect that digital tooling. So we weren't just interested in the kind of effect the product will produce, we were interested in what were the kind of conditions to produce them, and what kind of labor will be necessitated and will derive from. So similarly, the act of drawing differs in digital space as it does in physical space. While typically perceived through a two-dimensional surface, digital tooling itself is actually embedded with three-dimensional information. What's visible to us, it's merely a representation of information, a representation of thickness sometimes, much of which is driven by the conditions of viewing by the software interface. We wanted to expand on those notions of figuration and profile we initially studied in those chess projects, and try to open up a new set of tectonic and representational and perceptual conjecture by being able to fabricate these one-to-one. The formal attributes of the product started with the idea of simple extrusions of profile, profiles that begins to intersect obliquely in the product and begin to rotate planes. We wanted the objects to have the perceptual attributes as if one is looking into an axonometric or an elevation or an oblique or all those conditions at once. So the projection of form in depth or the thickening of a wall or bolt will be controlled by a number of different directions or vectors, as opposite to automatically offsetting everything a predetermined amount equally for every direction in space. We thought that this will allow each constituent part of the installation, a wall, a bolt, a slab, a beam, a recess, however conditions we can name exist on the product, to begin to project and deepen in their own way. That means that the edges are never contained by a single plane, which makes it a little difficult to delimit exactly interior from exterior, if there could be an interior in a product like this, but also fronts and backs and so forth. all these sites begin to exist in more than one elevation, which begins to kind of call into question that posture of the object that we were looking also in the smaller chess set projects. The notion of profile here is also further amplified via this myriad of seams that delimit regions of wood grain. And wood it's a bit of a misnomer. There is no wood in this project, not at all, even though it looks wooden all around. So it's made of laminates, laminates that are plastic. So you're not looking at wood itself, you're looking at an image of wood that therefore gains different degrees of flexibility in being composed, being oriented in space. Laminates are mounted on the MDF, also no wood, and one of the most important innovations of the fabrication of the product was be able to produce this control curvature, which was done via kerfing, essentially channeling at parallel trajectories the curved part of the panel in order to bend it, but not enough to break it. So that kerfing is what allowed for that, essentially for those radii to turn corners. So each one of the edges or poly edges that exist in the installation acquire their own spatial standing, their own posture, and they enter into a kind of relationship with the nearing wood grain. The last formal attribute that we had in mind when crafting the project was the idea of a kind of plural cutaway. We wonder if we could design an artifact in which each functional element, moment, or part could be cut by different planes, obviously without sacrificing kind of material continuity or integrity. Obviously thinking of Gu Chassis and John Randelet that produced these what you call surveys. They were buildings that were already made or ruins that were already ruinated. But these famous cutaway actions that we usually do to analyze and scrutinize construction and assembly methods. We always found these ones very interesting. I have them always around the office, and I usually stare at them. And the kind of composite section cut drawings that begin to reveal different continuities in architecture as a kind of material artifact. It's something that fascinates us. So those cutaways don't just represent a single moment in the form of the construction of the whole building, but it's a kind of begin to cut what we call a kind of metonymic fragment. It's a kind of fragment that begins to have these kind of self-similar qualities with a larger kind of property of the product, and and begins to be representative of all the moments, begins to be interchangeable of the kind of physical properties and formal properties of the product as a whole. So what was important to us was that all these formal and geometric relationships from form to section, or form and poché, or profile and silhouette, profile and seams and grains, can be associated to a well-known form of drawing, like delineating or shading or hatching. And this is the kind of palette that we start to hone in. And what we could conceive a product while being a kind of rigorous form exercise in construction could also express certain graphic values that have to do with the way architects think, project, or work through drawings. We like to think that thick it's a bit of a promiscuous object. It's one that's trying to draw and build, which seems to be somehow a bit of a divide somehow in our generation. It begins to get actualized, those drawing ideas begin to get actualized through that notion of material depth, that graphic qualities begin to activate notions of material depth. All right, so I promised a building, so here we go. Almost before we started thick, we were looking at this single-family residence in Argentina, where I'm originally from. And we were still thinking about this idea of how perceived thickness, volumetric thickness, and ideas of screening and layering begins to move from the installation to a kind of to the problem that when it enters into domestic architecture, it begins to kind of signal to all the problems in a way. So we started the project conceptually in a similar territory, even though aesthetically perhaps they are very different. So Piaggio House takes the name from the street where it sits. It's a renovation of a two-story 1960s house that we recently completed, actually January this year. It's in the periphery of the city of Rosario. It's about 2,150 square feet, and it proposes to transform typical mechanisms of domestic security and defensive architecture into social infrastructure. And it does this through the strategic delamination of security grates and glass walls. The idea is to attempt to thickening the threshold between interior and outdoor space with these flexible verandas. So this Argentine courtyard residence was designed for an extremely private couple, a non-traditional couple with a very private life, but still interested in indoor-outdoor living. The design accentuates the overlapping uses of private and semi-private space through the layering of recessed volumes and spaces and windows. As a response to the client's requirement for extra security features, we're talking here fences, gates, and window grates, elements which are typical of single-family homes in this urban neighborhood, a neighborhood that has been invariably touched by two major financial crises since the 2000 and more recently 2018, which keeps going into 2019 apparently. We propose here a strategy which attempts to redefine privacy infrastructure into a framework for social and space use. So the strategy of, yeah, you like this drawing? The strategy of layer voids and the separation of security device from glass walls begins to thicken and expand the threshold or entryway of a home and allows it to serve as a flexible multi-use space. In Argentina, these security devices are a common feature of every home. Often a home will require several layers of this type of armature to protect the domestic life of its residents against any real or perceived activities of trespassing. So aside from protecting the interior life of the house, for us, these apparatuses are also integral to the way a house conceals, protects, and divides itself against its neighborhood and context. Despite their ubiquity, these security devices are often seen as merely ornamental to houses, a prosthetic feature to the architectural design rather than an integral aspect of the social functions of a house and its position in the urban fabric of a neighborhood. For this single-family home, we face the physical constraints of a narrow plot within a very tightly subdivided urban grid. The house sits on a 28-foot wide lot, a very narrow lot. It shares its party walls with its neighbors, like 99% of the buildings in Rosario. So like, just to give you an idea, a fully detached house or even a semi-detached house is very rare, which is a condition of the it's a condition of these very tight plots. And it's sandwiched between a 1920s street-facing one-story house to the west. It's what you see on the right and a recessed two-story cottage to the east. So Piaggio House, the chamfer corner, which is perhaps one of the only massive moves that the house has, acknowledges this neighborhood context of pitch roof cottages. We read in it a bit of a kind of profile of the house as a dog ear profile, which kind of calls out the house like a favorite page of a well-worn book, and it connects seamlessly with the neighboring next to it. The building's simple rectilinear form is punctured on the street and rear-facing elevations with these staggered recessed windows, which alternate in a kind of checkerboard pattern of solids and voids. This is the front yard, which you're looking at right now, and in it, the composition of the two-part window begins to visually double the two-story composition of the house. So just very quickly through the plan. Oops, the plans don't have the numbers. Anyhow, I'll describe it. It accommodates the every rhythms of Argentinian family life. It features 3 bedrooms, all upstairs, 2 baths, and the requisite asador, where Argentines conduct their business every weekend, almost religiously. The rooms in the ground floor scheme are all organized so that one flows into one another from the street to the backyard, so you can get a clear shot from entering through the door on the right all the way to the backyard. And in the top floor includes the front-facing, north-facing master bedroom, a second bedroom, and a very large studio that overlooks the backyard. As I said, this is an addition to an existing house. That existing house belongs to a kind of weird typology. It's called a corridor house. It's a very weird typology, just shown in plan. Allows to essentially bypass the house from the side. So it's like a bypass that connects the front yard and the backyard, and it's believed that it's that way because of services. So you will just, either a maid or somebody else will enter with bicycles. Kids will enter with bicycles and just connect front yard, backyard. That doesn't sound so atypical from a semi-detached house, but because here everything is so narrow, it makes of that space, it makes the mass of the product absorb that space inside. It becomes a partially interior space. So this is what you see on the top section. That space that is shown with the square tiles is that side corridor that becomes a double story. It's another example of these kind of thickened thresholds where a lot of rooms look at, in this case, the studio and the 2 bathrooms, creating this kind of layer privacy. We continue that main layout of the house, of this side service corridor, with the little tail on the back of the house that creates the service spaces like the laundry room, the barbecue pit, and yeah, so it essentially continues that given layout that we inherit in the existing house. So we have this like all glass door that begins to connect dining and living rooms with this veranda or sun deck on the back, allowing for the glimpses of a little lemon tree that you can unfortunately picture on this photo. The idea is that the house can be completely open and completely closed. Again, clients were very specific about this extra layer of security. The U-shaped stair in the front, located along the front facade, connects lower and upper levels, while a double height window, which is what you see up into that double height, begins to allow for glimpses of the street beyond the carport canopy. Sorry, I'm going to go faster through this. It's a bit repetitive. On the exterior, the house, it's clad in white stucco. It gives the building a kind of monolithic appearance. It's the kind of limited, mostly white material palette that continues throughout the house. Very sober, cement-grade ceramic tiles cover the house floors, inside and outside, and Carrara marble begins to clad the interior. So these are essentially one of the photos that captures this perceived activity of trespassing. The photographer had to jump over the fence to be able to get this shot of the front yard, which is like pretty solid otherwise from the street, and begins to kind of reveal that layer composition of the stagger voids. Some night shots. Lofty space between dining room and backyard. All the kind of white palettes. Again, the house, it's like pretty sober in its material choice, creating connection between the kitchen and the dining room. And then some backyard shots of the space fully open at night when it begins to close up. The next 3 projects, and I'll end with these 3. How are we doing with time? 6:20. These 3 projects deal with the notion of objects that oscillate between being simultaneously a drawing and an object or a building. They reveal different ways by which material technology and problems of representation begin to get entangled. This is a recent project, very close to home. It's a project that we started with this idea of how graphic conditions studied via drawing and render can begin to affect and reorganize the forms of perceiving objects, achieving another levels of complexity in a project like this. It's a project for the Everson Art Museum, organized by the School of Architecture and the Everson Art Museum director here in Syracuse. The competition called for a novel and active use of the Rosenfeld collections, a ceramic collection. The call was very explicit. It asked that the collection was to be used in regular cafe services, which is something pretty revolutionary for a work of art to be passed to not just museum goers, but also users. Our proposal, soft service, seek to further the use of that collection as a public-facing educational resource, and it offers the museum and cafe visitors an opportunity to participate in the curation and presentation of the ceramic collection. We brought together stationary and rotating display systems that borrow from the encyclopedic tendencies of museological displays and the culinary traditions of Kaiten sushi. Yeah, what a match, huh? Through the use of the conveyor belts, we produce what we call a kind of mobile still life. In Kaiten sushi, the sensuousness of raw sushi is put on display and into service through its constant rotation between the restaurant and the kitchen, and it transforms dining into a kind of creative and social act. In our proposal, the experience of visitors are similarly transformed through a mobile station which circulates the ceramic piece and is put into use for displays and dining. The mobile stations are designed to fit within a landscape of soft seating and dining furniture. These soft pieces are constructed of, or will be constructed of playground rubber and insulation foam to minimize the kind of hazardous collision of ceramics with hard surfaces, while at the same time infusing the cafes with an inviting and warm atmosphere of kind of a playscape. The rotation of the ceramic pieces allows the kind of vibrant colors and textures of the forms and silhouette to circulate through the cafe in a kind of serial presentation and representation. This seriality of form harkens the kind of long history of precedent studies that form essentially the core of a potter's education, and also alludes to the kind of iterative process of making ceramic itself, using the wheel and kind of and rotation device in order to copy the form, a profile to create bases and other objects. So that mobile station offers an opportunity to present this seriality of making through a seriality of viewing, and produces what we call a mobile still life. Last two projects, I think perhaps an even more contested condition of thickness in representation and rendering in representation arises when the substance or materials at hand, it becomes transparent. What kind of syntax can emerge out of architecture's geometric and material organization as it butts up against the order of nature? That was one of the questions that we asked ourselves for this competition for the Architectural League on Socrates Sculpture Park for Foley. That particular year, they asked for a greenhouse. Those questions underlie this proposal we call House of Multiples. It's not a proposal for an object within nature, in our opinion, but it's essentially nature within the object. And it was for us a kind of, our purpose was to rendering nature through the prismatic lens of architectural conceits. House of Multiples, it's a physical artifact of a representational system that is translated into material form. The project takes its cues from the architectural conventions of rendering shadow, in which the directionality of the lines follow the planar surface. These lines become the base of a constructive system via polycarbonate tubing, through whose concavity and turns begins to refract nature inside and into serial reproductions of the image of nature inside the project. So when viewing the greenhouse, the serial effects produced by the refracted imagery becomes an architectural lenticular. The burdening of thick materiality over the image of nature that begins to mediate the viewing subject. The product begins to multiply foreground and background images into a bit of an architectural kaleidoscope. Here it's an unfold of the surface looking at the context of Socrates Sculpture Park. Quickly, I'm going to go through this. It was a quick project, also attempt to be made through polycarbonate tubing with miter edges, constructed a section of it, how nature will exist inside of it. All right, so just want to close with a project I picked in particular because it's close to the studio we're teaching here at Syracuse, and it's a project that begins to perhaps further amplify this idea of scenes and screens that we're trying to kind of describe in each one of our projects. It's a project in 2016 that we're asked to put an installation of a room. I'll speak a little bit about the setup. The invitation was the result of essentially a last call for installations, last one. A series of exhibitions that took place in a hotel room in Los Angeles. In truth, no one asked us to make an installation. We were only asked to make a project that was meant to be critical of the installation as a medium for architectural experimentation. What the shape and scope of such criticality looked like was up for grabs. A text, a film, a performance, anything could go. A refusal even was all viable. By default, we were all assigned a hotel room. Our product began with a naive question: what can we put in this room? Specifically, what can you put in a room that can be understood as a body of work in an installation context, yet it's not an installation. It's another of the impossibilities that we'd like to go towards in projects, at least when we begin to conceptualize the project. How can we make a comment on the last installation? Were all kind of questions that were on our head. What does it mean to show work in a hotel room? Never done before. I don't know if I would have that opportunity to do something like that. So this is a room. It's perhaps the opposite of a white cube gallery, the opposite extreme you can possibly imagine. The palette of colors, of vivid colors, even the dust probably this picture doesn't make justice to in the generic motel room. We're all there. We began by asking ourselves, like, what if we figure out a way to forbid access to the room? All the rooms look the same. It was the only thing that you could probably see and not unsee as you move from room to room. That kind of mortgage floral bed, the mahogany walls, and all the color palettes. You weren't particularly you weren't really inclined to relax in it, I would say. It was a room full of stuff, and we wanted to essentially figure out a way to replicate all that form of beauty, if you want, but at the same time forbid access to the room. So the one thing that we thought we would do, and I'll explain with the previous picture, was to essentially create these two perspective boxes that will fit on the door and on the window that faces the parking garage, that reproduce an image into the room, but yet it forbid the access to it. And we studied different ways of mapping. There wasn't really a right way of mapping it because it's essentially an impossibility to map an image into a perspective box. So we wanted to study different points of views that the viewers will try to stand around and try to materialize those things, understanding there will be a kind of distortion in the projection no matter what. More importantly, we started to construct these digital collages of the room, which essentially require us to make up for the material the image or our not so wide angle lens would not cover, because the picture frame was not as big as the image that the perspective box needed to cover. So we needed to essentially photograph the room, but also at some level re-render it. It was a kind of very weird process back and forth between image photography and rendering. And eventually we started doing these study models that began to study that kind of mapping process and how the image will deconstruct into this type of unfolds, which is very similar to what we're asking our students to do this semester. We did this model, which we're reading a little bit of Robin Evans, the developed surface drawing, and the problems that arise when you attempt to not just describe or render the room, but also the objects in the room that don't want to conform to architectural modes of drawing, like in this case, the developed surface. So what happens? Where does the bed belong? Does it belong on the wall? Does it belong on the floor? As it begins to open up, it begins to create a number of important questions. All the shots of the bed turned upside down. For us, was a project that it opened this kind of territory of being perhaps even more explicit than in all the projects with images. In this case, being really a photograph and that turned into this image construction. Whereas in all the projects, that the idea of the image, either from a drawing of a model or an image of the model or an image of a material that poses to be something else, like in thick. The product here, it really began to touch upon perhaps more explicitly and more literally into manifesting and instantiating an image across a spatial and a spatial device like a perspective box. The kind of important thing for us into this project is that begins this idea of the real and the render, the form of depiction that we're trying to kind of cross over between different modes of representation and different type of materials involving different tool paths, different modes of technological fabrication, begin to slip kind of past one another and begin to kind of call for a different kind of way of describing using language in terms of describe what's image, what's form, what begins to create a kind of space. So that idea that I described earlier, and this is a video, we'll see if it plays. That idea, that kind of impossibility of beginning to describe what's image, what's object that was captured by, perhaps best by Arnold Aronson in describing the history of scenography as a kind of battle with space and a battle with the image, kind of that pendulum that moves across from the Renaissance period to the modern period in scenography and theater design, perhaps got best explained here in this project between the passage of the real and the render. I'll leave right there. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. So we have a reception waiting for us downstairs, but we have time for a couple of questions, if there are any questions.
Thanks, Maxi. You used the word promiscuous when you were talking about the thick project, and it got me thinking about like the broader ways in which the body of work conveys a kind of promiscuity. What I mean by that is I find moments where the work comfortably associates itself with, let's say, tendencies and interest sets and fascinations of a previous generation. So complex form, the tracing of technique and process in the result, interrogation of process and technique, and also presenting the project through that lens. Mm-hmm. But simultaneously, like, engages, let's say, interest sets of an emerging generation, things like flatness, graphic expediency, and presenting the projects through the kind of observable qualities of the result. And that project in particular reminded me of like qualities that were accessible in the project that Michael and Kutan presented at Adjacencies. And I've always thought of their body of work as also kind of being equally comfortable in across generational divides, if we could say such a thing. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious, like, if engaging multiple discourses and thinking about how the project fits generationally, which is also a word used a couple of times, like, mm-hmm. how that is consciously something that's being worked on. Are you imagining that the project is kind of working across multiple sets of interests, or is it just something that emerges more naturally?
I think that's a great question. And I like the comparison with Michael and Kutan. I think there could be many others that could be drawn to that comparison, but more importantly, because we're classmates and I was like literally the same generation and going to studying with the same people. I don't know if I have a definite answer to that question. I think it touches on form and complexity. We are not necessarily interested in achieving complexity per se. I will say, if there's one thing evident for every product, that it varies the degree of complexity, and I like to think of that as it engages something very directly, which as I try to describe today, it sometimes has to do with a certain technique of manufacturing, like the lathe, right? So sometimes we consciously work against that. So like in the third iteration of the chess, I had similar questions like the ones you asked, like this kind of, like, are we going to become, by doing this kinds of project, a kind of franchise? Is this chess set going to be one of those repeatable things in which one becomes kind of expectable, becomes a bit of a brand, and we consciously work against that, and we use techniques of flattening, techniques, I would call it just inside of the kind of dumbing down the project and achieving a kind of conceptual complexity without necessarily manifesting itself into a formal complexity. I would say formally the third project, which is the one that probably would have been most complex because it's done by robots and all that, theoretically, would have been the one that in which formally a lot of my colleagues will probably think, well, that's essentially an alibi to explore form at its deepest. For us was the contrary. It was like to explore concept at its deepest in a way and almost achieve a project with a kind of 0 degree of formalism, but it was the last one in the sequence in a way. So it depends on the project, and I think it depends on the problem at hand, how we tackle that question. Another way of answering the question is I'm a formalist. I don't have a problem with that, but I'm also a person that I would say the same for Jia. If she was here, probably she would agree. We're not married to a particular style. We like to think of problems. We like to, as I try to say, we like to go to these impossibilities, and that's what gets us thinking into and going in a particular direction. So I would say that's why I don't know if I have a definite answer to that question. I am interested in techniques of flattening, in techniques of describing a formal ambiguity of the architectural object. I would just say not every project kind of lends itself to that kind of ambition in the same degree or at the same rate. I don't know if I'm answering the question fully.
I think it's refreshing, I think, to see the range,
yes.
Especially in a time where I think younger offices are a bit more concerned with establishing a kind of identity and even a brand, if you will, which I think at times can be dangerous to kind of limit the types of projects that one is understood to be capable of working on. And so I think there's a lot, like you just said it, like there's the conceptual development precedes any type of aesthetic development, and there's certain tendencies aesthetically that kind of linger across projects. But yeah, I guess I just appreciate the fact of the way in which the projects kind of work on those issues without the anxiety about finding their way into an aesthetic that's associated with them.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a great observation, and we often think about that. I think there is a change of attitude, I would say, in contemporary practice. When I went to school, the people I would look like, even the people who studied, had that anxiety a lot stronger, I would say, than I don't know, our generation, even younger people. There is more of a kind of plural idea of how to look at architectural practice, and I think also there's also, I would say, and this is speaking personally, speaking of reproducibility, the fear of become reproducible in a way, or become a kind of practice that one could anticipate in a way. Of course, we all have our ways of doing things. That comes natural, and you know, as Molly said, I have a very technical background. I was trained to draw, and I think there are certain rituals that come in the architect's training that push you to do similar things. But I think through kind of problematizing the project, sometimes you can work against those natural tendencies we have in order to somehow look for kind of, side, not completely different, but side kind of approaches and responses. Yes. Hi. Good. Thanks for coming today.
Yeah. I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, but I was interested in the disassociation and then reassociation of material to the forms that you're using. So thinking about the thick project, for instance, it's a wood laminate, which gives it a particular scalar reading.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting here thinking, well, I wonder if it weren't wood. I wonder if it were, I don't know, marble laminate or just color or something like that. And then when you showed the house, there were very, very large patterns that you chose of, I think, granite and also marble on the wall, sort of almost overscaled. Of course, they're natural, but overscaled patterns. So I guess I'm interested in the way that you choose materials and that scale that we associate with that material in response to forms which in some ways are amaterial.
Yeah, yes. I think that's a great question. We chose wood or wood laminate. There are two distinctions. There are real wood laminates, there are real wood, and there are all ones like Formica, which is the one we see in every counter, which is a fake one, right? It's an image printed. But we went to wood because of its consistent grain, because I wanted to essentially do things with wood that wood doesn't want to do. Essentially domesticate the material to behave graphically in a very precise way. Just because we like to make those kinds of drawings and we like to make the kinds of illusion that the material is projecting in a certain way and creating an illusion of three-dimensionality that the form won't necessarily do. So that's the flatness that Kyle was talking earlier about. Sometimes it goes with the material, sometimes with the form, sometimes it doesn't go with the form together. So it reads it and misreads it in a way. When we presented this project at SCI-Arc, we had a discussion later with the director and all the faculty, and one of the comments that came, which kind of amused us, said that the products were kind of reminiscent of enlarged grandma's pieces of furniture, which essentially brings up the kind of imagery that we never ask ourselves whether we wanted to be associated with it or not. In a way, it does present a certain notion of a quiche materiality, if you want. I didn't have a problem with it, but it wasn't a starting point for us in a way. Our starting point was much more direct, which is like, how can we domesticate a material and gain full control of its posture so we can cooperate and not cooperate with the description of an object. With the house in Argentina, with marble is probably a material for kitchens that gets used the most. I was surprised of the scale of that grain as well. The nature is like operating from the United States in a house in Argentina. It's definitely a challenge. This house took like 5 years in the making. For a little house like this was definitely not a recipe that I will give students in a way. But I don't know how we choose materials. I think I would like to answer that we choose overall forms of representation. In this case, for this house, given the budget, given my distance to it, and the fact that it was for a family member, in this case my sister, I needed to have the house be somewhere monolithic materially. So I needed to expand the bandwidth of white as much as possible and operate in that realm, because I knew that if I would go outside of that, I could, if it was a product in which I would have more control, I would get into some problems. But the grain interests us a lot. We have product in the making right now, like the Everson, in which the grain is non-directional, and we're exploring ways in which that can be screened and produce different greenness as well. It's not as easy to domesticate. It's a little bit more of a wild creature, but we're still interested on it.
So I think at this point, maybe we should go downstairs and continue the conversation down there amongst the food and drinks. But please join me in thanking Maxi for his great lecture.
Thank you.